Welcome to the first episode of Global Lens Conversations with Professor Doug Guthrie. In the new series, we're expanding our perspective beyond China to explore global issues shaping our world today. We are planning to release one episode each week, alternating between the two series China the News for China focused discussions, and Global Lens for a wider range of international topics. Stay tuned as we break down the most pressing headlines from around the world. I'm Christine Ying, your co host and producer, and joined by my dear friend and co host, Professor Doug Guthrie. In this series, we are diving into global challenges, focusing on the critical role of moral leadership in addressing them. So, Doug, could you elaborate what we mean by moral leadership and why it's such an important focus for us at this time?
Sure. Thank you, Christine, and thanks for working with me on this. And I always enjoy our conversations. And I'm so excited about us expanding. As you know, my lifelong vocation is to be a China scholar and study China very deeply. And I've grown up in that field. I was very, very long ago as an undergraduate in college studying Chinese, and then sort of fell in love with studying the Chinese economy as a graduate student. But as you build your life and you learn how to fit in academia, you also have to fit into functional areas of expertise that are not just about areas of the world, but are also about how people do things in businesses. And so I became a management and leadership person. And so, that I sort of lived those dual lives and those dual hats of thinking deeply about China and how to help business leaders and anybody who's trying to understand what's going on in the world today and what's going on in China, understand that part of the issues. And so it's been so much fun to talk with you and do our China in the News series. But I also feel like I have a deep passion for teaching leadership, and I also feel like we're in a moment in the world where we need deep thinking about leadership. And leadership is not just about how you build a strong functional organization that is able to achieve its strategic goals and build lasting organizational structure and culture, but it's also about moral questions. It's about how we behave in the world and what we do in the world every day. And that's true for corporations and the Steve Jobs and the Tim Cooks and the Elon Musks of the world, but it's also true for people in the political world, like our new president, President Trump, and Senator Cory Booker, and his 25 hours and 5 minutes filibustering in front of the Senate. These are leadership questions also. Right. And so I just love the fact that we're expanding beyond just talking about China in the news, Christine, and really thinking deeply about the big questions that are facing us in the world today. Right. Tariffs aren't just trade questions and economic policy questions, they're moral questions. And so I'm thrilled to be here with you and excited about the expansion of our work.
I'm really excited. So today we'll examine the ripple effects of policies and decisions that often have unintended consequences, sometimes hurting the very American they claim to protect. Let's discuss three recent policy proposals. One, Florida's rollback of child labor protection. Two, Trump's tariffs on Canadian lumber, which will unintentionally result in the cost of everyday goods like toilet paper. And three, Trump's tariffs on China is likely to backfire U.S. farmers. So let's get started with Florida. Florida lawmakers are pushing legislation to allow children as young as 14-year-old to work overnight shift without break, even on school nights. This is being framed as a solution to labor shortages caused by a stricter immigration enforcement. But critics say it's undermining child labor protections and disproportionately affects low-income families. Well, personally, as a mother of two teenage boys, I find this absolutely deplorable. We're talking about kids who should be in school, studying, and preparing for their future, not filling in for labor shortages caused by policy failures. So let's be clear, the situation is a direct response of squeezing out undocumented immigrants, which traditionally take these type of jobs. So Doug, what does this tell us about labor policies being shaped right now by federal immigration policy? Is this a desperate fix for a broken system or something more troubling?
Well, I mean, thank you for this question, Christine. And again, we're talking, I'm so excited with our discussions that we're moving beyond just the focus on China, which is we both have a deep passion for and is really important, but we're developing a conversation about moral issues, moral leadership issues. And this is, to answer your question quickly, um, this is both, right? It's both a desperate fix for policies that are having unintended consequences, but they were predictable consequences. But it's also something more deplorable, right? And so the desperate fix part, yes, like so you start blaming people over borders, whether it's blaming people in China or blaming people from across the southern border, as you know, the reason why Americans don't have the jobs that they want. People are stealing their jobs, whether it's, you know, corporations going to China and using Chinese labor, or it's people coming across the border, or it's just you want to control your borders because you want to have a really clear sense of what the American system is and what the borders are, and undocumented immigrants are part of the problems that we're facing. Okay, so there's a lot of rhetoric that we've heard about that in the lead up to President Trump's first election in 2016 and his second election now in 2024. Um, and so we've heard a lot about this, but these ideas, if you're going to close the border and stop undocumented immigrants from coming across the border, this is going to have consequences like labor shortages in Florida, right? And so, you know, this was probably, I mean, this was certainly predictable. Like we could have seen this coming, um, but we didn't, or we ignored the possibilities of it. And now the idea that they're changing child labor laws so that these individuals, to your point, who should be in school, are now going to be working nights without breaks. And I mean, it's to me, it's just unconscionable and outrageous, right? And so it is a desperate fix, but it's deplorable as well. But the more deplorable part of this is not just the policy that's being set in place and how you as a mother and I as a father just think it's outrageous that um, that we'd be changing child labor laws because of a shortage of labor, because of policies that we put in place to stop undocumented immigrants from coming into the country. But the more deplorable, or the other deplorable part of this, is just a thoughtless approach to policy, right? I mean, it's just, what are we doing that politicians who are running this country are so thoughtless in terms of, you know, they're doing things that they think that got them elected and get a lot of political rhetoric out there. But then there are labor shortages, and then they think, well, what are we going to do to solve that problem? Like, let's change child labor laws. And, you know, to clean up the mess that we thoughtlessly created in this ad hoc process. And so to me, it's just outrageous and deplorable, and it's a desperate fix, but it's something that our country should be ashamed of, and it's just a mark against moral leadership. Like it's not happening here. This is bad leadership.
Well, you're absolutely right. Now, let's shift focus to talk about something that hits home for everyone: basic necessities. The administration recently announced a 27% on Canadian lumber imports, which has sparked concern about potential toilet paper shortage in the US, like we experienced back during the pandemic. Wood pulp is essential for making paper products, and these tariffs could drive up costs and even limit supply. Doug, this isn't just an economic policy, it's something that affects Americans in their everyday lives. What is the big picture here?
So here again, you know, the big picture is ad hoc sensationalistic approach to building or reforging economic policy and trade policy, right? I mean, the president got elected on the idea that, you know, we need to rebuild borders and we need to really have strong borders on and tariffs on goods that are coming into this country because we need to rebuild the American economy this way. And you and I have talked about this before, but you know, this approach to, you know, building our economic borders and creating tariffs around the world, you know, some people believe the rhetoric of it, but as you and I have discussed this much more deeply, you know, tariffs have a very basic function from an economic standpoint. The idea is that you raise the price of goods coming into your country from other countries such that there will be a price equalization between the goods coming in from across your borders to the goods that are produced inside of your borders. And then, people will presumably think, well, if the prices are equal, then I'll buy American, and that'll create more jobs and more income flowing into this country to support the goods in the process of creating those goods. And, it'll be good for job creation as well as just keeping money inside of our own borders instead of sending that money to places like China and Canada. The problem is, as you and I have discussed previously, is that for that to work, you have to have the internal manufacturing supply chains to create the same goods that you're raising the prices on. And in many of these cases, we don't have those internal manufacturing supply chains anymore. Or you have to have the natural goods like wood or oil or other things that we need for our economy. And we have some of those goods, but we certainly don't have as much, for example, in the case of wood, as Canada does. And so if you're going to create tariffs on goods that come in from Canada on things like wood, that's going to raise prices of those goods for American consumers. It is a direct tax on American consumers. No, when Donald Trump and JD Vance say that this is a tax on Canada or China or Canadian companies or Chinese companies, that is a lie. It is American consumers who pay the higher price because it's the companies that pay the price as the goods are coming across the border, and they just raise prices from consumers. That's how it works, right? And so there's just this general bizarre rhetoric on tariffs that it's going to create jobs, it's going to increase goods in good economics in the American economy. All it does is hurt consumers. And so we've seen this with blustering about tariffs with China and real tariffs that have been set in place going back to 2018 in China, but now more and more tariffs. And now we have the new, just yesterday, I guess, was Emancipation Day of, with the new tariff rhetoric about reciprocal tariffs and the announcements around these issues. The numbers look terrible, Christine. Like the amount of tax on goods that are going to come across the border from Canada, China, Mexico, the EU are going to raise prices for American consumers. We don't have the manufacturing supply chain or the raw industry goods to replace these. And so it is just going to increase costs for American consumers. That's all. So it's a ridiculous, ridiculous situation. And I love your example. Like if we don't have wood from Canada, and wood is critical for making paper and toilet paper, it's just going to raise prices for basic goods that Americans need. So I'm very, very disgusted by this.
Speaking of tariffs, Trump's tariff is so far-fetching that it included some remote uninhabited islands like Heard Island and McDonald Island right off the coast of Australia. So the joke now is even the penguins are not spared from the 10% tariffs.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
Um, well, let's shift to a major issue that could have long-term consequences of American farmers. We talked about some farmers I saw on TikTok literally said 70% of my workforce is undocumented immigrants. I know that. So they're not coming to work. My farm is shutting down. So now Trump is proposing new tariffs on Chinese goods, which could provoke retaliation from China, just as we saw in 2018 when China slashed its purchase of U.S. agriculture and shifted to European suppliers. I believe it was soybeans. This time, farmers could face falling crop prices again, forcing them to rely even more on government subsidy. We've been here before, Doug. So in 2028, soybeans and pork producers took a major hit when China imposed retaliatory tariffs. The US government had to step up with billions of subsidy just to keep these family farms afloat. And yet, many farmers still support Trump. How do you see this play out? And are we looking at a repeat of history?
So I'll take each of the parts of your question on, and you've sort of stated the clear aspect of this. When we saw this play out in 2018, it was very clear what happened, right? So there was aggressive tariffs, 300 billion in tariffs from the Trump administration towards China in that period. And China responded. They had retaliatory tariffs, and farmers were hit hard, right? And so it was again the case that now in China's case, remember what we were just saying about tariffs. Um, for tariffs to work, you have to have a process that increases, if the prices are increased because of the tariffs, that people can turn to other goods internally, right? And so, again, for US farmers to be hurt by retaliatory tariffs, it means that Chinese consumers saw the prices going up and they decided they were going to purchase things elsewhere. And so the tariffs end up hurting then because there's a change in exports. And, when I was most recently looking at the data on this in 2018, the retaliatory tariffs that came about, we saw a negative 76% change in the exports for the agricultural industry during that time period, right? And so it's clear that the tariffs in China's case work in the very negative fashion. The prices aren't just passed on to consumers. Consumers decide we're going to buy other things elsewhere, so we're not going to pay the higher price, right? And so this is a very, very devastating thing was a devastating thing then for U.S. farmers and will be this time as well. And so then the second half of your question is really about like, okay, well, we have an agricultural sector and it's an agricultural sector that is going to need help. And so subsidies then are going to have to come in and help the agricultural sector that's going to be hurt by first the U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods and then the retaliatory tariffs against the American agricultural sector, right? And so that's it. Just again, this is ad hoc policymaking that just doesn't have any logic to it. And you just wonder, these people are leading our country, and why are they thinking like this? Why aren't they thinking this through? So that's just the sort of economics of this. You also asked, why is it that these people are still supporting Trump pretty heavily? And this is an interesting question, Christine. And I want to go into a territory that I think we should talk about because we're talking about moral leadership, but I think it's sad because I think what has really driven the Trump administration to do what it's doing is it's this very sort of American centric or Americanistic or, very sort of bloated sense of American pride that has basically is really pushing to isolate America in the world, right? I mean, I think one of the healthiest things that's happened for the America in the last 50, 60, 70 years is, post World War II era is that we've become a much more integrated world, right? And we've even become much more integrated with China post 1979 and Deng Xiaoping's visit to Jimmy Carter in Washington, D.C. And this is good for everybody, in my opinion, because it means that we're getting along peacefully, we're working together, we're building our economies. Companies like Apple, Tesla, and Walmart have benefited from being in China, but the world has benefited from cheaper and better products and the manufacturing supply chain. But I think President Trump has tapped into this notion of what I think of as American centric, isolationism and maybe even racism, right? And so as the American economy has gotten worse, as you know, I often blame not the Chinese for stealing our jobs, but I blame Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan and neoclassical economic theory and the transition away from a Keynesian state-based system where we have states and markets working together to a market system which just fosters the idea that corporations should make money for their shareholders and that's it, right? And so they went to China, right? And they went to different places around the world, and America lost a lot in terms of jobs. But the American economy we think is still good because, it's still the largest economy in the world. But what has happened is that the agricultural and manufacturing parts of the supply chain have been replaced by high-end service sector economy. So you have a lot of investment bankers and consultants and accountants and lawyers who make a lot of money and still keep the American GDP at the highest in the world. But you have a lot of people who used to make a lot more money in the agricultural and manufacturing sectors who are not making as much money. And so I think that Trump has tapped into this by basically saying, pointing the finger and blaming others. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the American labor force believe it. And so I think it's been a very, very quick sleight of hand. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people in agricultural and in manufacturing America and in blue states that have lost jobs, but they continue to believe this idea that we can blame China and blame Mexico and blame Canada and blame everybody else except the people that have sort of transferred the greatest amount of wealth from the American working class to the American upper 5% of society that we've seen in a century. Right now, we have the lowest corporate tax rate in America since 1939. And so I just think, you know, it's a lot of weird finger pointing, and it's sad to me that parts of middle America believe it, but that's where we are.
Well, I read a piece of news that the first trilateral talk in 5 years, China, South Korea, and Japan, the three countries got together and see how they should respond to U.S. tariffs. What's interesting is following World War II, both the South Korea and Japan became key U.S. allies. We are now pushing our two close allies to have economic collaboration with China, which is not putting ourselves in a very good position internationally. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, to your point, I think it's a fascinating moment. And again, I wish people in America would have woken up 6 months ago and seen what was coming. But yes, we're moving into an era of isolationism. And, you know, we can blame China, the second largest economy in the world, for having stolen a lot of our jobs and make out the idea that it's sort of the nemesis and we have to fight against it. But what we're doing in our isolationism is we're driving our allies into the arms of the global trading system and the leaders of global trade. China is still a very open place in terms of global trade, and it aspires to be. As you and I have discussed in other episodes, we've talked about the BRICS alliance, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and there's been several other nations that have joined that coalition recently. And we've talked about the Belt and Road Initiative and China really working to build a strong economic system that goes in the other direction and sort of pivots away from its interdependence with the United States and many European nations. And so it's so interesting that, okay, so we've made China out to be this evil empire because it's a communist country and it's not a democracy. But China is thinking very rationally economically, and they're making good decisions. And so our allies like South Korea and Japan are saying, hey, uh, do we want to be aligned with the country that's isolationist and creating trade wars, or do we want to be aligned with this other country, which is the second largest economy in the world and will be the largest economy in the world probably in 6 years, that seems very open economically. So let's pivot over here. And so I just, if people in the Trump administration are paying attention, they should be frightened. And it doesn't seem like they get frightened easily, but they should be really concerned about what's actually happening. And the fact that allies like South Korea and Japan are moving this direction, but also remember, it was just in the last year that Xi Jinping and Modi made sort of nice in over their border dispute. And what we're going to see now is we're going to see more and more development and alliance, not just with South Korea and Japan and China, but also with India. And it's going to be devastating for the U.S. economy, in my opinion.
Well, you talk a lot about BRICS. It like just so happens China has already diversified its suppliers. They're increasing their imports from Brazil, Argentina, and even Russia. If another trade war escalates, which I already see it, could we see China permanently move away from American agricultural products?
I mean, it's a big question because again, I mean, China is, a country of 1.4 billion people, and there are still probably somewhere between 3 and 400 million people that live in poverty. And China doesn't have near the kind of arable land for agricultural production that the United States has. And so if you think about the two countries as sort of similar in size in terms of what the footprint of just the landmass is, um, the United States has so much more arable land than China does. And so it's hard, and we have a very efficient and well-developed agricultural economy that has done very well over the last 100 years in developing its efficiency in the production and the machine-based production of a lot of goods. So it's hard for me to imagine that this will just all be shut down. But China is, as we discussed earlier in this episode, the reciprocal taxes or reciprocal tariffs, which are now leading to tariffs from China on U.S. goods that are hurting farmers in the agricultural sector. Um, China can play at this game too. But it's to answer your question, it's hard for me to imagine that there will be complete delinking here because there's just too much need.
Makes sense. Well, let's talk about the government subsidy. So in 2018, the Trump administration had to pay out about $28 billion in aid to farmers. And if tariff escalate and trigger another crisis, are we just looking at another round of taxpayer-funded bailouts?
So it's a great question, and it's going to be a really interesting time to think about this because with all the rhetoric around Doge and government cutting and cutting of subsidies and cutting of the inefficient subsidies that the government needs to help needy parts of the population, like those with Social Security, but also those in the agricultural sector. So I think they're going to get caught in an interesting kind of problematic rhetoric because as you and I were just discussing a few minutes ago, like this is a part of the population in America that helped get President Trump elected, right? I mean, there's strong support in, the lower income and working class parts of the economy, but also the agricultural sector. They helped elect President Trump. And so if it is the case that suddenly they are really the ones being hurt by the tariffs, um, and the reprisals from China, and suddenly they need a bailout, and they're going to have to dig into the uh, government funds to make that bailout. There's going to be a real problem. Now, my guess is that if that happens, they'll just do it. They'll do the bailout anyway. So they'll sort of contradict themselves, but they'll say, "But we are being a good government right now because we're doing exactly what our people need." And so I think that they will very quickly, and as I hear it and read about it now, I think like Doge and Musk are probably on the way out of the sweet spot with the Trump administration anyway, because
Well, from what I read, his 130 days is up. However, he's still going to remain a policy advisor, which I was very disappointed.
right,
So
right.
I don't think he's out, and I think all the but they someone did actually suggest that the Doge and all the staffers should undergo drug testing, which I totally believe.
Wow. Okay.
Um, so let's step back. So we talked about child labor law, tariffs on essential goods, and trade war that can backfire on American farmers. Do you think this is just a series of unintended consequences like we started out, or does it reflect a really deep failure on how our government has approached policymaking?
Well, and just to latch onto the end part of your comment here, um, the a larger failure in how we've approached policymaking. I think there's the short-term failure, which I just think this is crazy and ad hoc and risky. And, the idea that you'd put some person who's not elected into office in charge of this thing called Doge, and there would be suddenly firing tens of thousands of government employees. I mean, this is ridiculous, right? I mean, yes, you can make a case. I mean, I tend to be on the pretty liberal side of like having a welfare state and having a government that really is funded and subsidizes a lot of things that are needed. But you can make an argument that governments are inefficient and that the U.S. government has become bloated. Okay, but then there's a very careful, rational process for doing that, and we elect people in Congress, and we elect a president who appoints people who should be approved by Congress to make these kinds of hard decisions, right? And so the idea that you just have some person who is the richest person in the world who is just behind the scenes slashing and cutting and burning jobs, I think that is a disaster, right? So if you want to make the case that we could have more rational policy and we could have more of our government funded programs turned over to the market, okay, let's have that debate and let's have that conversation and let's do it in a very rational way where we have something called, if you're going to frame this as trickle down economic theory as Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan did, okay, let's really set up the programs in which corporations are or the private sector is taking over what is funded by the government right now. But if you're just going to do slash and burn and then just sort of walk away from this thing, we're going to see disasters coming. There are going to be lots of people without the resources, whether those resources are Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare or access to medicine, or it's going to be a disastrous situation, and it's coming. And so we're then going to see what the Trump administration is going to do with that. And again, my guess is that this is a lot of hand waving because there is a very conservative ideology that really came to power again in the early 1980s about the idea that we should just let the market decide all of these things. And so, but even if you're going to do this as a market-driven approach to the distribution of goods and needs for society, you got to have a rational process on how to set that in place. It has to be. And we're just not seeing that at all. It's a very irrational process right now.
Doug, it's really clear that policy decisions don't happen in a vacuum, and these consequences are actually felt by everyday people. So that wraps up our first episode of Global Lens. If you find this conversation valuable, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. It really helps more people find these conversations. We'll see you next time as we continue breaking down the global issues that shape our world. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Christine, and thanks for a wonderful conversation. And I'm so excited about us expanding more broadly to the issues of moral leadership and how we think about where our society is going. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you so much for your insights. Bye bye.